The paper said Martha Crane, but the man behind the counter at the land office didn't believe her the first time he read it. Not the second either. Sweetwater County, Wyoming Territory, June 1878. A woman alone wanting to register 160 acres in her own name was treated like a clerical error, not a decision. He turned the document around, as if the ink might have dripped into the wrong place. Asked if she didn't want to wait for her husband to arrive. She said she had no husband. He asked if her father wouldn't sign with her. She said her father had been dead for 6 years. The silence that followed was the kind that weighs, not because it's rude, but because it's honest. He didn't know what to do with a woman who didn't need permission. So he did what bureaucracy demands. He took the money, stamped the paper, handed over the receipt, and Martha walked out with a piece of land she hadn't seen yet, near Green River, where water was scarce, lumber was expensive, and every nail cost twice as much when the buyer was a woman. She thought the challenge would be the land. 9 months would prove that the real enemy didn't grow in the ground. It wore a suit, had an office, and knew exactly how to take what wasn't his without dirtying his hands. Sometimes the frontier doesn't break you with wind or hunger. It breaks you with paper, debt, and one man's word against yours. Before we go any further, tell me something. Where are you watching this from? City and country. I read every comment. Martha had come from Pennsylvania, not the green hills near Pittsburgh, but the narrow valleys farther east where the mines ran dry and the work followed. Her father had been a stonemason before the drink took him. Her mother lasted 3 years after that, then died the way poor women often did, quietly, without ceremony, in a room that smelled like old wood and camphor. Martha was 17. She worked in a boarding house for 2 years, then a tailor's shop for 3 more. She saved carefully, ate less, wore the same dress until the seams split and had to be re-sewn by hand in lamplight that made her eyes ache. She didn't talk much, didn't trust easy. And when a man at the boarding house, a railroad clerk with soft hands and a loud voice, started lingering near her in the hall, started suggesting she could do better than mending hems if she was willing to be practical about things, she knew it was time to leave. She had read about the Homestead Act in a newspaper someone left behind in the parlor. 160 acres. Free, if you could prove it up. 5 years of residence, cultivation, improvement. She didn't care about free. She cared about hers. A piece of ground with her name on it, not her father's. Not some man she'd have to marry just to keep a roof overhead. She saved another 6 months. Bought a train ticket west. Took nothing with her but 2 dresses, a coat that had belonged to her mother, and a small leather pouch with $23.60 inside. The train ride took 4 days. The coal smoke settled into her hair and clothes like a stain that wouldn't wash out. The air grew thinner as they climbed into higher country. The green disappeared. What replaced it was something harder. Plains that stretched so far they looked like they'd been scraped flat by something unforgiving. The sky was bigger than anything she'd ever seen. It made her feel small in a way the city never had. In Pennsylvania, you were small because the buildings were tall and the crowds were thick. Out here, you were small because there was nothing else to measure yourself against. Just land. Just wind. Just distance. She got off the train in Green River on a Tuesday afternoon in early June. The platform was raw lumber, still pale with newness, and the town was barely a town at all. A freight depot, a general store, a land office, a saloon with no sign, and a scattering of tents and shacks that looked like they might blow away if the wind decided to care. The heat was dry and immediate. It pulled moisture from her skin, made her lips crack within an hour. She stood there on the platform with her bag in one hand and the address of the land office folded in the other, and she felt the first cold edge of doubt slide into her chest like a blade she hadn't expected. But she walked anyway. The land office was a narrow building with a single window and a door that didn't quite fit the frame. Inside, it smelled like dust and ink and tobacco. The man behind the counter was older, maybe 50, with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses that sat crooked on his nose. His name was Augustus Petrie. He didn't introduce himself. He just looked up when she came in, waited for her to speak. She told him she wanted to file a claim, homestead entry, 160 acres. She had the filing fee. She had chosen a parcel near the river, Section 12, based on a surveyor's map she'd studied in Pennsylvania. Petrie blinked, set down his pen, asked her to repeat herself. She did. He asked where her husband was. She said she didn't have one. He asked if her father was filing jointly. She said her father was dead. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him trying to decide if this was real or some kind of mistake he was supposed to correct. Finally, he sighed, pulled out the forms, and began filling them in with slow, deliberate strokes. He made her repeat the parcel number twice, made her sign 3 separate documents, took her $14 for the filing fee, and didn't give her change for the quarter she'd added by accident. When he handed her the receipt, he didn't look at her, just slid it across the counter and said, "You've got 5 years to prove up, build a house, cultivate the land, live on it. Miss any of that and it reverts." She nodded. He added almost as an afterthought, "It's hard country out there, especially alone." She didn't answer. She folded the receipt, put it in her coat, and walked out into the heat. The land was 4 miles south of town, along a dry wash that fed into the Green River during spring melt, but ran empty most of the year. She hired a man with a wagon to take her out there for $2. He didn't ask questions, just loaded her bag, drove her in silence, and left her standing in the middle of a flat stretch of sagebrush and alkali dust with nothing but sky in every direction. No trees, no shelter, no water she could see. Just the claim marker, a wooden stake driven into the ground with faded numbers burned into the wood. Section 12. Hers. She stood there as the sun dropped toward the horizon, turning the sky a strange burning orange that looked almost unnatural. The wind picked up, carrying grit that settled on her skin, in her teeth, under her collar. It wasn't loud. It was constant. She thought about the boarding house in Pennsylvania, the narrow room with the slanted ceiling, the smell of boiled cabbage and lye soap, the railroad clerk's voice in the hallway. And she thought about the fact that this empty, hard, wind-scraped piece of nowhere, was the first thing in her life that belonged to her and no one else. She knelt down, put her hand flat against the dirt. It was warm from the sun, dry as bone, and it didn't give her anything back. No promise, no comfort, just dirt. But it was hers. And that, she decided, would have to be enough. By mid-June, Martha had learned what the land office didn't tell you. That 160 acres of Wyoming dirt wasn't the same as 160 acres back east. That water didn't run where you needed it. That lumber cost 8 cents a board foot if you were a man with credit, and 12 cents if you were a woman paying cash. That the wind never stopped, and the sun never softened, and the nights dropped so cold in spring that you woke with frost on the inside of your coat. She slept the first week in the wagon bed she'd borrowed from a freighter for $1 a night. It wasn't shelter. It was just a box with wheels parked near the claim marker, and it smelled like old grain and rust. She wrapped herself in her mother's coat and lay flat on her back, staring up at stars so thick and bright they looked like something spilled. The silence out there wasn't peaceful. It was total. No voices, no footsteps, no horses in the street or dogs barking or doors slamming shut. Just wind, and her own breathing, and the feeling that she was the only living thing for miles. On the 8th day, she walked back into Green River and bought what she could afford. A handsaw, a hammer, 60 pounds of nails in a burlap sack, 2 lengths of canvas for a temporary roof, a cast iron skillet, a sack of cornmeal, another of beans, a small tin of lard, salt, matches, a water barrel that had a crack along the bottom seam but cost half price because of it. She paid $41 total. It left her with $6 in change, and the man at the counter, a thick-shouldered German named Keller who ran the general store, looked at her purchases and said, "You building something?" She said yes. He asked if she had help. She said no. He didn't say anything after that, just wrapped the nails in old newspaper and handed them over without meeting her eyes. She hauled everything back to the claim in 2 trips, carrying what she could on her back and dragging the rest on a travois she made from cottonwood branches she'd cut near the riverbed. It took her all day. Her shoulders ached. Her hands blistered and bled. By the time the sun set, she was sitting on the ground next to her supplies, too tired to stand, and she realized she hadn't eaten since morning. She opened the cornmeal, mixed it with water from the barrel, and fried it in the skillet over a fire she built from sagebrush that burned too fast and smelled bitter. The cake came out hard and tasteless, but she ate it anyway, chewing slowly in the dark while the wind pulled heat from the flames and scattered ash across the dirt. The next morning she started building. She had no foundation, no frame, no plan except the one she'd seen in a pamphlet back in Pennsylvania. A dugout, half buried in the ground with sod walls and a canvas roof until she could afford lumber. She chose a low rise near the dry wash, where the ground sloped just enough to give her a wall on one side. She dug with a spade she'd borrowed from Keller for $3 deposit. The earth was harder than she expected. Not soil, but clay mixed with rock and roots from sagebrush that went down deep and had to be cut with the saw. Her hands, already blistered, cracked open. She wrapped them in strips torn from her spare dress, but the fabric soaked through with blood and dirt by midday, so she stopped wrapping them and just kept digging. It took her 9 days to carve out a space 10 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 4 feet deep. She stacked the sod she cut into walls, each brick heavy and crumbling, and she learned quickly that wet sod held better than dry, so she hauled water from the river in a bucket and soaked each layer before setting the next. The walls rose slowly, 3 feet, 4. By the time she got to 5, her back felt like it had been beaten with an iron bar, and her legs shook when she stood. She didn't stop. She stretched the canvas over the top, nailed it to cottonwood poles she'd dragged from the wash, and weighted the edges with stones. It wasn't a house. It was a hole in the ground with a roof, but it was hers. She moved inside on a night in late June when the wind was so strong it tore one corner of the canvas loose and sent it flapping like a broken wing. She crawled into the dugout, pulled the canvas back down, and lay on the dirt floor in total darkness, listening to the wind scream outside. The walls smelled like wet earth and roots. The air was cool, almost damp. She closed her eyes and felt the weight of the ground around her, and for the first time since Pennsylvania, she slept without waking. July came with heat that sat on the land like a hand pressing down. The river shrank. The grass, what little there was, turned brown and brittle. Martha planted a small patch of beans and squash near the dugout, hauling water from the river every morning in 2 buckets that left her shoulders bruised and her hands raw. The seeds sprouted, thin and pale, and she watched them the way you watch something fragile that you're afraid to touch. She built a small fence from scrap wood to keep out rabbits, though she'd only seen one, and it had looked half-starved. She worked every day from first light until dark. There was always something: patching the roof, reinforcing the walls, digging a drainage ditch when the rain finally came in August and turned the dugout floor to mud. She learned to move slowly in the heat, learned to cover her head with a cloth soaked in river water, learned that if you worked too hard without stopping, your vision started to blur, and your hands stopped obeying, and you'd find yourself sitting in the dirt with no memory of how you got there. She saw people, but not often. A freight wagon passed on the road 2 miles north, heading toward the rail depot. A shepherd moved a flock across the far edge of her claim in early August, didn't acknowledge her when she waved. Once, a rider stopped at the top of the rise and sat there on his horse for a long time just watching. She couldn't see his face. He didn't come closer. After a while, he turned and rode off, and she stood outside the dugout with the hammer still in her hand, heart beating hard, until she couldn't see him anymore. By late August, her money was nearly gone. She had $2 left, and the beans were starting to come in, but not enough to sell, barely enough to eat. She walked into Green River and asked Keller if he had work. He looked at her for a long moment, then said he didn't. She asked at the saloon. The man behind the bar laughed, not meanly, but like the question itself was funny. She went to the land office. Petrie looked up from his desk, recognized her, and said, "You still out there?" She said yes. He nodded slowly, like he was surprised, and said, "Well, that's something." But he didn't have work either. She walked back to the claim with nothing. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and orange that looked like fire, and she thought about the fact that she'd been here 2 months and hadn't spoken more than 50 words to another human being. That the only voices she heard were her own and the wind. That the loneliness out here wasn't the kind you could fix by being around people. It was the kind that came from knowing you were alone in a way that mattered. Alone in your labor. Alone in your risk. Alone in the certainty that if you failed, no one would catch you. She sat outside the dugout that night and ate a plate of beans with no salt, no lard, just beans boiled soft in river water. The stars came out, bright and cold and infinite. And she thought about Pennsylvania, about the boarding house, about the railroad clerk and his soft hands and his voice in the hall. And she thought about the choice she'd made, to come here, to file the claim, to put her name on a piece of paper that said this land was hers. It had seemed like freedom back then. Out here, it just felt like a different kind of trap. One you built yourself, with your own hands, and couldn't walk away from without admitting you were wrong. But she didn't walk away. She finished the beans, washed the plate in a bucket of river water, and went inside to sleep. September brought cooler air, but it didn't bring relief. The heat broke, the nights grew longer, and the light took on a slanted golden quality that made the land look softer than it was. Martha's bean plants withered despite the watering. The squash produced 3 pale fruits, small and bitter, that she ate anyway because throwing them out felt like waste. She pulled the dead vines, composted what she could, and turned her attention to winterizing the dugout. The canvas roof wouldn't survive snow. She knew that. So she saved what little money came from selling her mother's coat to a woman in town, $4, less than it was worth, and bought rough-cut lumber, 8 boards, enough to frame a proper roof if she was careful. She worked through late September, laying the boards across cottonwood beams, sealing gaps with mud and grass. Her hands had calloused over by now, hard and thick, but the work still hurt. Splinters drove deep under the nails. Her shoulders ached at night in a way that didn't fade with rest. She told herself it was progress, that every board nailed down was one step closer to something that could last. But the truth was harder to name. She was tired, not just in her body, somewhere deeper. The kind of tired that sleep doesn't touch. It was early October when she first saw Coleman Wade. She was hauling water from the river, both buckets full, arms shaking with the weight, when she noticed the horse on the ridge to the west. A big sorrel gelding, well-fed with a rider sitting tall in the saddle. The man didn't move, just sat there watching her, silhouetted against the sky. She set the buckets down, straightened, and waited. He didn't come closer, didn't wave. After a long moment, he turned the horse and rode south, disappearing behind the rise. She didn't think much of it. People passed through, ranchers checking their stock, surveyors, drifters. But 2 days later, he was back. Same spot, same horse. This time he stayed longer, maybe 10 minutes before riding off again. And the day after that, she saw him on the north side of her claim, near the road, talking to another man on horseback. They were too far for her to hear, but she saw the way they gestured toward her land, toward the dugout, and something cold settled in her chest. She asked about him in town the next time she went in for supplies. Keller was weighing out 5 pounds of flour when she said, "There's a man who keeps riding past my place, big sorrel horse. Doesn't stop, just watches." Keller's hands paused. He didn't look up. "That'd be Coleman Wade," he said quietly. "Runs cattle south of the river. Got about 4,000 acres under lease, maybe more. Been here since '74. She waited. Keller tied off the flour sack and finally met her eyes. "He doesn't like homesteaders much. Says they carve up grazing land, fence off water, ruin the range." Martha said, "I'm not fencing anything, I don't even have cattle." Keller nodded. "Doesn't matter to him. You're there. That's enough." She paid for the flour and left, walked back to her claim with the sack on her shoulder, and when she got to the top of the rise, she saw them. 2 of Wade's men on horseback, riding slow along the western edge of her property. They saw her. One of them tipped his hat, not friendly, just acknowledging. Then they kept riding, cutting straight across the corner of her land like it wasn't hers at all. By mid-October, it was happening every few days. Riders crossing her claim. Cattle, 20, 30 head at a time, being driven across the dry wash, trampling the spots where she'd tried to plant winter rye. She found hoof prints in the mud near her water barrel. Found a section of her makeshift fence kicked apart. The wood splintered like someone had ridden through it on purpose. She rebuilt it. 2 days later, it was down again. She didn't confront them. She wanted to. Wanted to walk up to one of those riders and ask what the hell they thought they were doing. But she'd seen the way they carried themselves, relaxed, confident, like men who'd never been told no by someone who mattered. And she'd heard the stories about a homesteader up near Rock Springs who'd filed a complaint, said Wade's men were running cattle over his wheat. The complaint went nowhere. The land office said it was open range, hard to prove. A month later, the man's well was fouled with something dead, and he sold out for half what he'd put in. So Martha stayed quiet. Fixed what got broken. Watched the riders when they came, memorized their faces, and said nothing. Then, in late October, Coleman Wade came himself. She was outside, splitting kindling for the stove she'd bought second-hand, a small cast-iron box that burned hot if you fed it right, when she heard the horse. She looked up and saw him riding slow down the slope toward the dugout. He was older than she expected, maybe 55, with a thick gray beard and a face weathered hard by sun and wind. He wore a good coat, wool, well made, and his hat was clean. He stopped 10 feet from where she stood, didn't dismount, just sat there looking down at her with an expression that wasn't quite hostile but wasn't friendly either. "You're the Crane woman," he said. Not a question. She nodded. He looked past her at the dugout, at the lumber stacked beside it, at the sad little garden plot and the water barrel with the crack. "You planning to stay out here?" he asked. She said, "I filed a claim. I'm proving it up." He nodded slowly, like he was considering something. "It's hard country," he said, "especially for someone alone. No shame in selling. I'd give you a fair price for the relinquishment." She felt her hands tighten around the axe handle. "I'm not selling." He studied her for a moment. "Water's scarce out here. Land's no good for crops. You won't make it through winter." She didn't answer. He leaned forward slightly in the saddle. "I'm trying to be neighborly, Miss Crane. Offering you a way out before you lose more than you can afford." She met his eyes. "I didn't ask for a way out." The silence that followed was heavy. He straightened, adjusted his reins, and said, "Suit yourself." Then he turned the horse and rode back the way he'd come, slow and deliberate, like a man who had all the time in the world. She stood there with the axe in her hands, heart pounding, and watched him disappear over the rise. And she knew with a certainty that felt like cold water down her spine that it wasn't over, that the visit wasn't kindness, it was a warning. And whatever came next would be worse. November came early and cold. The first snow fell on the 8th, light and dry, melting by afternoon but leaving the ground hard as iron. Martha worked faster, trying to finish the roof, chinkling gaps in the dugout walls with mud and straw. She'd bought a cord of firewood from a man in town for $6, nearly the last of her money, and stacked it against the north wall where the wind hit hardest. The stove burned through wood faster than she'd expected. She rationed it, let the fire die at night, woke to frost on the walls and her breath visible in the dark. The cattle came through again in mid-November. 50 head, maybe more, driven hard across the dry wash and straight through the spot where she'd planted rye. They tore up the ground, left it churned to mud, and when she went out to look, she found the water barrel tipped over, the cracked seam split wide, water soaked into the dirt and gone. She stood there in the cold with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the wreckage, and felt something crack inside her that had been holding for months. Not anger, something quieter, closer to despair. She righted the barrel, saw it was ruined, and left it where it lay. Walked to the river with a bucket, filled it, walked back. Did it again, and again. It took 16 trips to fill the dugout's small reserve tank, and by the time she finished, the sun was setting, and her arms felt like they'd been pulled from the sockets. She sat on the ground outside the dugout, back against the sod wall, and watched the sky turn dark. And for the first time since she'd left Pennsylvania, she let herself cry. Not loud, not long, just enough to feel the weight of it, and then she stopped, wiped her face with her sleeve, and went inside to sleep. 2 days later, Coleman Wade's foreman came with papers. His name was Horace Tinker, and he rode up to the dugout on a cold morning in late November, with a leather satchel across his saddle, and an expression that was all business. Martha was outside, repairing the fence again, the same section that had been knocked down twice already. When she heard the horse, she straightened, saw him coming, and felt her stomach tighten. Tinker was a lean man, maybe 40, with a narrow face and eyes that didn't give anything away. He worked for Wade, managed his accounts, handled his contracts. Everyone in Green River knew him. He was the kind of man who never raised his voice because he didn't have to. He stopped a few yards from where she stood, dismounted, and pulled a folded document from the satchel. "Miss Crane," he said, his tone polite, almost apologetic. "I'm here on behalf of Mr. Coleman Wade. There's a matter of debt that needs settling." She looked at him, then at the paper in his hand. "I don't owe Mr. Wade anything," she said. Tinker nodded like he'd expected that answer. "I understand it might seem that way, but according to our records, you've incurred charges for water usage, grazing interference, and damage to livestock operations on open range adjacent to your claim. The total comes to $72. The number hit her like a fist to the chest. $72. She didn't have 72 cents. She stepped closer, kept her voice level. "I haven't used any water that wasn't from the river, which is public. I haven't grazed anything. And I haven't damaged any livestock. Your men have been running cattle across my claim for 2 months. Tinker's expression didn't change. "The dry wash you're drawing from feeds into Mr. Wade's irrigation channel downstream. Water drawn upstream reduces his available supply. That's a cost. The cattle you mention, they're moving through open range, which is their legal right. If your improvements were damaged in the process, that's a risk of filing a claim in grazing country." She felt heat rising in her face, her hands clenching at her sides. "You're saying I owe him money because he let his cattle destroy my fence?" Tinker unfolded the paper, held it out toward her. "I'm saying there's a bill, signed and dated. If you'd like to dispute it, you're welcome to take it up with the county office in Rock Springs. But in the meantime, the debt stands." She didn't take the paper. "I'm not paying for something I didn't do." He lowered his hand, refolded the document, and put it back in the satchel. "That's your right, Miss Crane. But I should inform you that Mr. Wade is within his legal authority to seek compensation. If the debt remains unpaid, he can file a lien against your claim. And if that lien isn't satisfied within 60 days, the claim can be seized and sold to cover the balance." The word "seized" sat in the air like smoke. She stared at him, trying to process what he was saying, trying to find the lie in it. But Tinker wasn't lying. He was just doing what men like him always did, using the law like a tool, bending it just enough to make theft look legitimate. She said, "This is my land. I filed it legally. I've lived on it, improved it, worked it. You can't just take it because you wrote a number on a piece of paper." Tinker's expression softened, just slightly, and that was worse than if he'd stayed cold. "I'm not taking anything, Miss Crane. I'm just delivering the notice. What happens next is up to you." He mounted his horse, tipped his hat, and rode off without another word. She stood there in the cold, watching him go, and felt the ground shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the earth. She'd known Wade wanted her gone, but she hadn't understood how easy it would be for him to make it happen. No violence, no threats, just paper and a system that believed men like him over women like her. She went inside the dugout, sat on the edge of her cot, and stared at the dirt floor. $72. She didn't have it, couldn't get it. Even if she sold everything she owned, the stove, the tools, the lumber, it wouldn't be enough. And even if it was, paying it would mean admitting the debt was real. would mean accepting that Wade had the right to charge her for water she'd drawn from a public river, for damage caused by his own cattle. It would mean bending. And she knew, deep in her bones, that if she bent once, he'd break her the rest of the way. She thought about going to the land office, filing a complaint. But she'd heard what happened to the man near Rock Springs. Complaints didn't matter when the man you were complaining about owned half the county and had the ear of every official who mattered. She thought about leaving, just walking away, taking what she could carry, and going somewhere else, somewhere easier. But the thought made her sick. Not because she loved this place, she didn't, not yet, but because leaving would mean Wade had won. And worse, it would mean she'd proven every man right who'd ever looked at her like she didn't belong. By early December, the pressure had become a presence. Wade's men rode past more often, sometimes twice a day, always slow, always watching. They didn't speak to her, didn't need to. Their presence was the message. The cattle came through again, 100 head this time, driven straight across the claim in the middle of the day. And when she ran out to try to turn them, one of the riders just sat on his horse and watched her, expressionless, until she stopped and stepped aside. The herd churned the ground to frozen mud, knocked over what was left of her fence, and kept moving. She rebuilt the fence. Again. Her hands were numb from the cold, her fingers so stiff she could barely grip the hammer. She worked in silence, alone, and when she finished, she sat on the ground and looked at what she'd made. A crooked line of scrap wood that wouldn't stop a determined dog, let alone a herd of cattle, and felt the weight of futility press down on her like a hand. That night she didn't eat, didn't have the energy to build a fire, to boil water, to chew and swallow. She just lay on the cot in the dark, wrapped in her coat and a thin wool blanket, and listened to the wind howl outside. The dugout creaked, the roof rattled, and she thought about the fact that she'd been here 6 months and had nothing to show for it but debt, exhaustion, and a piece of land that was slowly being taken from her by a man who didn't even need it. The next morning she walked into Green River. It was the coldest day yet, the sky low and gray, the wind cutting through her coat like it wasn't there. She went to Keller's store first, asked if he knew anyone who might have work. He shook his head. Not this time of year. Everything shuts down till spring. She asked if he'd heard about Wade's debt claim. He nodded slowly. I heard. I'm sorry, Miss Crane. She asked if there was anything she could do. He didn't answer right away, just looked at her with something close to pity. You could pay it, he said finally, or you could leave. Those are the only ways this ends without you losing everything. She left the store without buying anything, walked to the land office. Petrie was there, hunched over his desk, and when she came in, he looked up and sighed like he'd been expecting her. She asked him if a lien could be filed against a claim for fabricated debt. He said, if the debt's disputed, you can file a counterclaim, but you'd need proof, receipts, witnesses, documentation. She said, I have receipts for everything I bought. I never bought anything from Wade. Petrie nodded. Then you'll need to prove he didn't provide you with services or goods. And that's harder, because if he says he did and you can't prove he didn't, the burden falls on you. She stood there, feeling the walls close in. So he can just lie, and I have to prove the lie, and if I can't, I lose my land. Petrie took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes. I'm not saying it's fair, Miss Crane. I'm saying it's the law, and the law favors documentation. Wade's got lawyers. He's got records. He's got men who'll sign whatever he tells them to sign. You've got your word. And I'm sorry, but in a dispute like this, your word doesn't carry the same weight. She left the land office and walked back toward her claim. The wind had picked up, blowing snow that stung her face and made her eyes water. She pulled her coat tighter and kept walking, boots crunching on frozen ground, and she thought about everything she'd left behind, the boarding house, the narrow room, the railroad clerk. The choice she'd made to come here, to file the claim, to believe that a piece of paper with her name on it meant something. And she wondered if she'd been wrong. If freedom was just another kind of lie, people told themselves to make hard choices feel like brave ones. But even as she thought it, she kept walking. Because the alternative, giving up, admitting defeat, handing Wade exactly what he wanted, felt worse than anything the land or the cold or the debt could do to her. She reached the dugout just as the sun was setting, the sky streaked red and purple like a bruise, and she made a decision. She didn't have money, didn't have power, didn't have a lawyer or witnesses or anyone who'd stand with her against a man like Coleman Wade. But she had something he didn't expect. She had every receipt. Every scrap of paper, every record of every dollar she'd spent, saved in a wooden box under her cot. And if Wade wanted to bury her with documentation, she'd bury him right back. Martha spent the next 3 days going through everything she owned. She pulled the wooden box from under the cot and laid out every receipt, every slip of paper, every record she'd kept since leaving Pennsylvania. The train ticket stub, the receipt from Keller's store for the first load of supplies, nails, canvas, cornmeal, salt, the invoice for the lumber, the deposit slip for the spade, the filing fee receipt from the land office. She spread them across the dirt floor in rows, organized by date, and studied them like a map. She hadn't bought water from Wade, hadn't hired his men, hadn't purchased grazing rights or paid for passage across his land. Every dollar she'd spent she could account for. Every transaction had a name, a date, a signature. It wasn't much, but it was proof. And if Tinker came back, or if Wade filed his lien, she'd have something to show that wasn't just her word against his. But she knew it wouldn't be enough. Not by itself. Wade didn't get where he was by being sloppy. If he claimed she owed him money, he'd have something to back it up. Forged invoices, false witnesses, documents signed by men who worked for him and would say whatever he told them to say. She'd seen it before, back in Pennsylvania. Seen landlords evict tenants with debts that didn't exist. Seen bosses dock wages for damages no one could prove. The system didn't care about truth. It cared about who had the better paperwork. So she needed more. She needed to know what Wade was claiming exactly. Needed to see his documents before they were filed if possible. And that meant going places she hadn't gone, asking questions she hadn't asked. On December 10th, she walked into Green River again. The sky was low and heavy with snow that hadn't fallen yet, and the cold bit through her coat like teeth. She went to the freight office first, a narrow building near the rail depot where manifests and shipping records were kept. The clerk was a young man, maybe 20, with ink-stained fingers and a nervous way of talking. She asked if Coleman Wade had filed any invoices or shipping claims in the past 2 months that included her name or her claim number. The clerk blinked, looked confused. "I can't just give out that information, ma'am. That's private business." She said, "I'm not asking for his business. I'm asking if my name appears on any of his documents. Because if it does and I didn't authorize it, that's fraud." The clerk hesitated, looked over his shoulder like someone might be listening. Then he said, "Wait here." He came back 5 minutes later with a ledger, flipped through the pages, and shook his head. "Nothing under Crane. Nothing under your claim number either." She felt a small flicker of relief. "You're sure?" He nodded. "I keep every manifest that comes through here. If Wade shipped something in your name, it'd be logged. It's not." She thanked him and left. Next, she went to the assay office where land transactions and contract disputes were sometimes recorded before going to the county seat. The man there was older, less cooperative. He told her he didn't have time to go through records for every homesteader with a grievance. She said she wasn't asking him to go through anything, just to confirm whether a lien notice had been filed against Section 12, Range 18. He sighed, checked a thick book on his desk and said, "Not yet, but if it's coming, it'll show up here first." She asked how much time she'd have to respond once it was filed. He said 60 days from the date of notice. She nodded, thanked him, and walked out into the cold. By the time she got back to the claim, the sun was setting and the first flakes of snow were starting to fall. She went inside, lit the stove, and sat on the cot with her coat still on, thinking. Wade hadn't filed the lien yet. That meant he was waiting, maybe waiting for her to break, Maybe waiting for Winter to do the work for him. Or maybe waiting to see if she'd pay the debt just to make it go away. She wouldn't. Couldn't. Even if she wanted to, she didn't have the money. But more than that, paying would be admitting he was right. And she knew, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that this wasn't just about $72. It was about whether a woman alone, with no husband, no family, no man to vouch for her, could hold a piece of ground against someone who wanted it. It was about whether the law meant anything when the person invoking it had no power, and the person breaking it had all of it. She thought about the homesteader near Rock Springs, the one who'd filed a complaint and lost everything. She thought about the fact that Wade had done this before, and would do it again, and that the system allowed it because the system was built by men like him, for men like him. And she felt the anger she'd been holding down for months rise up in her chest like heat. But anger wasn't enough. She needed proof, not just of what she'd paid, but of what Wade hadn't provided. She needed witnesses. And that meant talking to people who didn't want to talk. The next day, she went back to Keller's store. He was stacking canned goods on a shelf when she came in, and when he saw her, his face shifted, not unfriendly, but cautious. She asked if they could talk. He nodded, led her to the back room where he kept inventory and closed the door. She told him about the debt claim, about the $72, about Tinker's visit and the lien threat. Keller listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "I can't testify against Wade," he said finally. "I do business with him. He buys supplies for his men, pays on time, never causes trouble. If I go on record saying he's lying, he'll pull his account, and I can't afford that, not in Winter." She nodded. She'd expected that. "I'm not asking you to testify. I'm asking if you've ever sold him anything on my behalf. Anything he might claim was for me." Keller shook his head. "No, everything you bought, you paid for yourself. I've got the receipts to prove it." She said, "Can I have copies?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Give me a day. I'll write them out." She left the store and went to the livery, where a man named Pruitt shod horses and rented wagons. She asked him the same question. Had Wade ever rented equipment in her name or claimed work done on her claim? Pruitt looked at her like she was asking him to step in front of a train. "Lady, I don't get involved in disputes, especially not with Coleman Wade," she said. "I'm not asking you to get involved. I just need to know if he's lied about doing business with me." Pruitt spat into the dirt. "He hasn't, I'd remember, and even if he had, I wouldn't say so in court. That man owns half this county. You cross him, you're done." She walked away, feeling the cold settle deeper. No one would stand with her. Not because they didn't believe her, but because believing her wasn't worth the cost. She tried 3 more places: the blacksmith, the surveyor's office, the boarding house where freighters sometimes stayed. Same answer everywhere. No records of Wade doing business in her name, but also no one willing to say so publicly. By the time she walked back to her claim, the snow was falling harder, and the light was almost gone. She spent that night writing everything down, every conversation, every receipt, every detail she could remember about Tinker's visit, about Wade's offer to buy her out, about the cattle driven across her land and the fences knocked down. She wrote it in pencil on the back of old newspaper, her handwriting cramped and uneven. And when she finished, she had 4 pages that looked like nothing, just the desperate scratchings of a woman with no power trying to prove she wasn't lying. But it was all she had. On December 15th, Tinker came back. She saw him riding up in the early afternoon, the same leather satchel across his saddle, and she knew before he even dismounted what he was going to say. She met him outside, stood in the snow with her arms crossed, and waited. He pulled out the document, official this time, stamped and signed, and handed it to her. "Lion notice," he said. "Filed with the county this morning. 60 days to settle the debt or the claim goes to auction." She took the paper, read it slowly. $72, plus interest, plus administrative fees. The total was now $81.40. She looked up at him. "This is theft." Tinker's expression didn't change. "It's a legal claim, Miss Crane. If you believe it's fraudulent, you can dispute it in court, but the lien stands until a judge says otherwise. She said, "I'll dispute it." He nodded. "That's your right. Hearing will be scheduled in Rock Springs, probably late January. You'll need to bring documentation, witnesses if you have them, and a filing fee of $5. $5 she didn't have. For a hearing that wouldn't happen for 6 weeks. In front of a judge who probably knew Wade personally. She felt the trap close tighter, felt the wall shrink, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Tinker must have seen something in her face, because his voice softened just slightly. "Miss Crane, I know this feels unfair, but Mr. Wade isn't a cruel man. He's offering you a way out. Sell him the relinquishment. He'll pay you $50. Enough to get you back east and start over somewhere easier. You don't have to fight this." She looked at him, at his narrow face and his careful words, and felt something harden inside her. "Yes, I do," she said. Tinker sighed, put the document back in his satchel, and mounted his horse. 60 days, he said, and then he rode off, leaving her standing in the snow with a piece of paper that said her land wasn't hers anymore. Unless she could prove a lie, no one would believe. The hearing was set for January 23rd. Martha had 43 days to prepare, $5 to find, and no guarantee that any of it would matter. She spent the week after Tinker's visit going through her receipts again, organizing them by date and category, writing out summaries in careful handwriting that her cold fingers made shaky and uneven. She made a list of every merchant she'd done business with, every transaction, every witness who could confirm she'd never dealt with Wade. Most of them wouldn't testify, but she wrote their names down anyway, hoping that if she showed up with enough documentation, the sheer weight of it might count for something. She still needed $5 for the filing fee. She had none. So she sold the last thing of value she owned, her mother's wedding ring, a thin gold band she'd kept in a cloth pouch under her pillow since Pennsylvania. She walked into town on a gray morning in late December, went to the assay office where the man sometimes bought small items to resell, and laid the ring on the counter. He looked at it, weighed it in his palm, and offered her $3. She said she needed $5. He said $3 was fair. She stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of what she was about to do, and then she nodded. He counted out $3 in coins, took the ring, and she walked out with the money in her pocket and a hollow feeling in her chest that had nothing to do with hunger. She earned the other $2 doing laundry for a widow in town, scrubbing clothes in icy water until her hands were raw, and her back ached so badly she could barely stand. The widow paid her in coins that felt heavier than they should, and Martha took them without speaking and walked back to her claim in the snow. January came hard and cold. The temperature dropped below zero most nights, and the wind was relentless, screaming across the plains and shaking the dugout walls like it wanted to tear them apart. Martha burned through her firewood faster than she'd planned, rationed it down to a few hours in the evening just to keep from freezing, and spent the rest of the time wrapped in every piece of fabric she owned, shivering in the dark. She ate once a day, cornmeal mush, sometimes with a little lard if she could spare it, and the hunger became a constant presence, dull and gnawing, that she learned to ignore the same way she ignored the cold. She kept working. Not on the land. There was nothing to do in winter, but on her case. She rewrote her statement 3 times, trying to make it clear, concise, impossible to misunderstand. She practiced saying it out loud, standing in the dugout with the stove cold and her breath fogging the air, speaking to an imaginary judge who she hoped might listen. She knew it was a long shot, knew that Wade would show up with lawyers and documents and men who'd swear to anything he told them to. But she also knew that if she didn't try, if she just walked away or gave up, she'd spend the rest of her life wondering if she could have won. On January 20th, 3 days before the hearing, she walked to Green River one last time. Keller had the copies of her receipts ready, written out in neat script and signed with his name at the bottom. He handed them to her across the counter and said, "I can't testify, but if the judge asks to verify these, I'll confirm them. That's the best I can do." She thanked him. It was more than most people had offered. She went to the land office next, Petrie was there, hunched over his desk as always, and when she came in, he looked up and sighed. "Hearings in 3 days," he said. She nodded. "I know." He leaned back in his chair, studied her for a moment. "You got a lawyer?" She shook her head. "Can't afford one." He grunted. "Wade will have 2, maybe 3. She said, "I've got receipts. I've got records. I've got proof I didn't owe him anything." Petrie rubbed his face, looked tired. "Miss Crane, I hope you're right. I really do. But you need to understand something. This isn't about right or wrong. It's about who the judge believes. And judges tend to believe men with money and standing over women with, well, over women." She left without responding, walked back to the claim in the cold, and that night she sat in the dugout with all her papers spread out on the floor and tried not to think about what would happen if she lost. If the lien went through, if the claim was seized and auctioned, and she had to walk away with nothing, she'd survive. She knew that. She'd survived worse. But the thought of Wade winning, of him taking her land not because he needed it but because he could, made her feel something she hadn't felt in months. Not fear, not anger. Something colder. Resolve. The morning of the 23rd was brutally cold, the sky clear and hard as glass. Martha dressed in her best clothes, the dress she'd worn on the train from Pennsylvania, mended now in 3 places and faded from sun and work, and packed her papers into a canvas satchel. She walked the 4 miles to Green River, caught a freight wagon heading to Rock Springs, and paid the driver 50 cents for a ride. The journey took 3 hours, the wagon rattling over frozen ruts, and by the time they arrived, her hands were numb, and her face felt like it had been slapped raw by the wind. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building near the center of town, larger and more solid than anything in Green River. She went inside, found the clerk's office, and paid her $5. The clerk gave her a receipt and told her to wait in the hallway outside courtroom 2. She sat on a wooden bench clutching her satchel and watched people come and go. Lawyers in good coats, men in clean hats, women with children who looked better fed than she'd been in months. Coleman Wade arrived an hour later with 2 men in suits and Horace Tinker trailing behind. Wade saw her, nodded once, and walked past without speaking. His lawyers didn't look at her at all. She sat there feeling small and out of place, and painfully aware that she was alone in a system built to favor men exactly like him. The hearing started at 2 o'clock. The judge was an older man, maybe 60, with a gray beard and a voice that sounded bored before he even spoke. Wade's lawyer went first, laying out the claim in calm, measured tones. $72 owed for water usage, grazing interference, and damages to livestock operations. He presented invoices, freshly printed, officially stamped, that showed charges dating back to July. He called Tinker to the stand, and Tinker testified that he'd personally delivered notice of the debt in November, that Miss Crane had refused payment, and that all documentation was in order. Then it was Martha's turn. She stood, walked to the front of the courtroom with her satchel, and laid her receipts on the table. She spoke clearly, without shaking, and explained that she had never purchased water from Mr. Wade, never hired his men, never authorized any services, that every dollar she'd spent was accounted for, and that the invoices presented by his lawyer were fabrications. She handed the judge her receipts one by one and walked him through each transaction: Keller's store, the lumber yard, the land office filing fee. She showed him the dates, the signatures, the proof that she'd paid for everything herself. Wade's lawyer objected, said the receipts didn't prove she hadn't used Wade's water or interfered with his grazing, said the invoices his client provided were legitimate business records, signed and dated, and that Miss Crane's word alone wasn't sufficient to dispute them. The judge looked at the papers in front of him, looked at Martha, looked at Wade, and for a long moment the courtroom was silent. Then he said, "Mr. Wade, these invoices you've provided, they're dated July through October, but they weren't filed with the county until December. Why the delay?" Wade's lawyer started to answer, but the judge held up a hand. "I'm asking Mr. Wade." Wade stood, straightened his coat, and said, We don't file every transaction immediately, Your Honor. We bill quarterly. It's standard practice. The judge nodded slowly. And the water usage charge. You're claiming Miss Crane drew from a channel that feeds your irrigation system, but the dry wash she's using is a natural tributary of the Green River, which is public water. How do you justify charging her for that? Wade's lawyer stepped in. The wash feeds directly into Mr. Wade's leased water rights downstream, Your Honor. Any upstream usage reduces his available supply. It's a recognized cost in grazing districts. The judge looked at Martha. Miss Crane, did you know you were drawing from a source connected to Mr. Wade's water rights? She said. No, Your Honor. I was told the river was public. I've never been notified otherwise. The judge leaned back, tapped his fingers on the desk. Mr. Wade, do you have documentation showing that Miss Crane was informed of these rights prior to incurring the debt? Wade's lawyer hesitated. We have standard notification procedures, Your Honor, but do you have documentation? A pause. No, Your Honor. The judge looked down at the papers again, looked at Martha's receipts, at Wade's invoices, and then at the filing date on the lien notice. And then he said, I'm dismissing the lien. The charges are unsubstantiated. The notification procedures weren't followed. And Miss Crane has provided sufficient evidence that she fulfilled her financial obligations independently. The claim remains in her name. The courtroom went quiet. Wade's face didn't change, but his jaw tightened. His lawyer started to object, but the judge cut him off. That's my ruling. Miss Crane, you're free to go. She stood there, not quite believing it, and then she gathered her papers, put them back in the satchel, and walked out of the courtroom on legs that felt unsteady. Wade was in the hallway when she came out, standing with his lawyers, and when he saw her, he looked at her for a long moment. Not angry, not defeated, just calculating, like he was deciding whether she was worth the trouble of a second attempt. Then he turned and walked away. She caught the freight wagon back to Green River just before dark, rode in silence as the cold settled in and the stars came out. And by the time she reached her claim, it was full night. She went inside the dugout, lit the stove, and sat on the cot with her coat still on. She'd won. The lien was dismissed. The land was still hers. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. Like she'd been given permission to keep fighting, but nothing more. She thought about Wade, about the way he'd looked at her in the hallway, and she knew, without question, that this wasn't over. That men like him didn't lose once and walk away. They waited. They adjusted. They came back differently. But she also knew something else. She'd faced him in a courtroom with nothing but receipts and her own voice, and she'd proven that his word wasn't law, that a piece of paper with her name on it meant something, even when powerful men said it didn't. Spring came slowly. The snow melted in March, the ground softened, and Martha planted again. Beans, squash, a small patch of wheat. The work was the same as it had been the year before, hard, relentless, lonely. But something had shifted. The riders still passed sometimes, but they didn't stop. Wade's cattle were driven around her claim, not through it. Tinker never came back. By June, a year after she'd filed the claim, the dugout had a proper roof, a wooden door, and walls chinked tight enough to keep out the wind. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And when she sat outside in the evenings, watching the sun set over land that bore her name, she felt something she hadn't felt in Pennsylvania, or on the train west, or in the first brutal months of proving up. Not pride exactly, not happiness, just the quiet, hard-won certainty that she'd chosen difficult freedom over easy constraint, and that she'd survive whatever came next. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is refuse to disappear when the world expects them to. Martha Crane didn't disappear. She stayed. And the land, in its own cold way, remembered. Have you ever fought for something that felt impossible, not because you were sure you'd win, but because losing meant giving up a part of yourself you couldn't afford to lose? Share your story in the comments. I read every one.